Hi, today I'm going to do the awaited TypeScript type challenge. So the goal of this challenge is to build a generic type that can pull out the type from inside a promise. So let's look at a few examples. So here I've got a type X of promise of type string, and when I pass it into myAwaited, I'm meant to get back just a string. Similarly, here I have a promise of type field number, and when I pass it through myAwaited, I'm meant to get just back a field or a number. The third example is a nested promise, so a promise of a type of string or number. And when I do myAwaited of Z, I'm meant to get back just the string or number. So it's meant to go in 2 levels deep into our promises and pull out the type from inside that. And the fourth example is a type that's 3 levels deep in a promise. So our type needs to work on promises of infinite level of depth. So I'm not going to worry about the third and fourth example for now, but I'm just going to work on the first example. So when I give it a promise of type string, I want to be able to get a string back. So let's change our myAwaited type to be a generic type that takes a t, and let's use a conditional type to return a string. So I want to say if t extends a promise of type string, give me back a string, otherwise give me back never. So this works, but it obviously only works for the first case at the moment. But we could kind of extend our condition here. We could say, if t extends a promise of type string, give me back a string. If t extends a promise of type number, give me back a number. If t extends an object type, give me back that object type. And let's do that one just to labor the point. So if t extends a promise of type string, give me back a string. Otherwise, if t extends a promise of type an object type where we've got a field and number, give me back a field and number, otherwise give me back never. And now this type works for the first 2 test cases, but it doesn't work for the third or the fourth. And like we could go on and extend our type with multiple like conditions to be like, if it's a promise of a string or number, give me back a string or number. But that's obviously like not what the goal of the challenge is. But what I'm trying to show you is that like we actually want to building like a generic type here that can sort of work out what's inside the promise and just give me back that. And in conditional types, we actually can do that with inferred conditional types. So we could say, we could change this, we could get rid of this junk. And we could say if t extends a promise, and then we could say infer, like inner, and then we could return the inner side. And this is like exactly the same as the previous 2 examples, but generic. So in the first example, inner becomes string, and we return string. And in the second example, inner becomes field number, and we return field number. So this type works for the first 2 examples, but it doesn't work for the third or the fourth. It doesn't work for the nested promises. So in the third example, where t is becoming a promise of a string or number, inner is becoming just 1 level inside that promise. So inner is becoming a string or number, and we're returning that. But we actually want to loop again. We want to be recursive, and we want to say, okay, if we've still got a promise at inner type, then we want to call myAwaited again. And if we don't have a promise, we want to just return what's inside it then. So let's just change this now. We could say, okay, if inner extends a promise, any promise, we don't care what's inside it at this point, we want to return. So if it's still a promise, we want to call myAwaited again of inner. And if it's no longer a promise, so if we've unwrapped all of the promise chains, then we want to give back inner. And this works, but maybe if we walk through one example, it will be clearer what's going on. So myAwaited of t, when we're passing in z, so we'll do this example. So t initially becomes a promise of a string or number. So t extends promise of infer inner. So we're inferring what's inside the first level of the promise and calling that inner. So what's inside the first level of promises is another promise. So just a promise of a string or number. And then we're saying, okay, is inner extends a promise, any promise? Well, it does in this case, because inner is a promise of a string or number. Okay, then we call myAwaited of inner. MyAwaited of inner, so t now becomes a promise of a string or a number. Does t extend a promise infer inner, it does, because we're still inside a promise. So inner now becomes a string or a number. So now does inner extend a promise? It doesn't anymore, because inner is now just a string or a number. So we don't call myAwaited again, but instead we just return inner. So inner is now a string or a number. So that's cool. So that all works, but there's still one failing test case. So down here, we're expecting error to throw an error. So when you pass myAwaited of number, it's meant to error, but at the moment it isn't. What is it giving back? It's currently giving back never. So we actually want this to throw. So we just need to constrain t. So we could say if t extends a promise of anything. And that's it. That's the completed type.